I would like to call
Casablanca, je vais
Professor
l'appeler,
Michel
professeur Michel
Prieur,
Prieur, professeur à l'université
professor
de
at the
Limoges.
University of
Donc
Limoges.
on
And of course, Professor
on a
Prieur is
toujours,
very
toujours les
well known. We are
présenteurs.
very
Nous sommes
delighted
très
to
heureux
have
de
him with
l'avoir.
us.
Nous
And
avons
uh,
le
he will
plaisir de
introduce to us a project
présenter un
which
projet
I mean,
qui me tenait
specifically
spécifiquement à
appreciate.
cœur
And
et je le remercie,
Ali
ainsi que le
MEKOUAR as well
professeur
is with us.
Monsieur
He's
Ali MEKOUAR, qui est le
online.
co-directeur du
Um,
CIBCE, qui est en ligne, mais pour
he is with
diverses raisons de
us. He
santé ne
will
prend
not
pas
take
la
the
parole. Mais
floor,
nous
but
la saluons très
Professor
chaleureusement.
Michel
Professeur Michel
Prieur
Prieur est ce
is,
mentor des
let's say, the
mentors et
mentor of everyone,
c'est
but
grâce à lui que j'ai
specifically for
découvert le
me,
droit
and
international et
especially for
régulièrement avec le
myself
Centre
and the
international de
protection
droit
of the
comparé pour la
environment,
protection
because
environnement.
Michel Prieur
Il
proposes to
propose
his
aux
students to,
enseignants et aux
bring
étudiants
his
de
students with
l'accompagner dans des
him and
conférences
participate
internationales
to
à
the
l'ONU.
international
Nous avons
conferences.
commencé nos
And
escapades en
Professor
2023.
Prieur,
Très
during
passionnant est
the,
le professeur Michel Prieur
international
lorsqu'il vous emmène
conferences,
dans ses conférences
has
internationales et nous aime.
this
C'est
opportunity
que
to,
ce sont
behind the
derrière
scenes,
la scène
define
des stratégies,
strategies
des
which are
stratégies
key.
diplomatiques
And,
qui
they're
parfois se
very much
jouent
important
vraiment à l'occasion
during
peut-être d'un
dinners,
dîner,
for
à l'occasion d'une
example,
négociation des
and
un pouvoir, et
also,
toujours
as
sous un
said,
prétexte de
behind the
légalité
scenes.
très
So
marqué.
I think this is
Et moi, j'ai
so
trouvé ça
nice
absolument
to have,
passionnant
to be trained
d'être formée
uh,
ainsi par le
with
professeur Michel Prieur.
Professor
Je pense que toutes les
Prieur.
personnes le
Everyone,
remercient
appreciates
pour
that. And as a
cette
teacher
transmission.
and as a
Et en tant
professor,
qu'enseignant, très
I
souvent je
also
suis enseignante, et
wonder
je me
how
disais comment
to,
va-t-on faire
give my students
transmettre à notre tour,
this
à nos
passion,
étudiants,
this, let's
ces,
say,
ces
know-how
coulisses
behind the
environnementales, ces
scenes,
coulisses,
secrets or
comment dire, ces
diplomacy
secrets,
secrets
ces
and techniques
techniques de
which allowed
diplomatie
the adoption of big
qui
international
ont
convention.
permis
How shall
l'adoption des
we,
grandes conventions internationales. Comment on va
diffuse
transmettre un
that
savoir qui finalement
behavior? And it
se
is
sait
thanks
que
to
par
our
nos
mentors
mentors qui ont
that this is
participé
possible.
en
So,
étant pionniers à ce
of
droit
course,
international de l'environnement. Je parlais
without
également de
further
Michel Prieur, Ali
ado, I would
Mekwa.
like to give the floor
Donc
to
sans plus
Professor
tarder,
Prieur
je donne la
now. He will
parole
introduce
au
to us
professeur
how
Michel
we've been
Prieur qui va
introducing this
présenter
research project and
comment on a mis en
how
place ce projet de
is the
recherche, comment
methodology applied
quelle a
and
été la
which
méthodologie
is the
suivie. Et même si vous n'avez
methodology
pas lu
applied.
Mécoire en ligne, il faut le
So,
saluer très
uh,
chaleureusement et lui
thank
adresser
you so much,
tout
first of all.
particulièrement nos sincères remerciements, car sans lui, il n'y aurait pas cet ouvrage.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Emily.
Merci,
Good
Grégory.
morning.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous.
This is a great pleasure
Donc,
today
nous
to introduce
allons
today
présenter
to you this
l'ouvrage
publication.
qui
It will be
va
published in the
sortir, je crois,
in
dans les
these
semaines qui
months,
viennent
Marais Martin
aux
editions.
éditions
This
Marais
is
et Martin
the title,
et qui
Immersion in
s'intitule
the
Immersion
diplomacy,
dans les coulisses
environmental
de la
diplomacy
diplomatie
behind the scenes.
environnementale internationale.
So, of course, this
Alors, la
kind of,
diplomatie environnementale
diplomacy and
internationale
research
fait
is
l'objet
extremely
depuis
important. We've been
quelques années
working on that for
d'une
ages,
attention
and
particulière
politicians,
du monde politique
researchers as well,
et des
are
chercheurs,
extremely keen
compte
on this
tenu
kind of
du
information. So
nombre
how
considérable
to, make
de
negotiations,
négociations
and also
internationales
how to
intervenues
deal
depuis
with uh,
maintenant une
these
cinquantaine
issues.
d'années,
The rhythm
mais
is
avec un
extremely
rythme toujours
fast
aussi grand,
because recently
puisque
we
dans les
have
années récentes,
seen
on
several
a vu
negotiations,
la
namely
négociation
biodiversity
de la Convention
negotiation,
sur la biodiversité
beyond
au-delà
national
des eaux
jurisdictions,
des juridictions
and we are
nationales,
living
et on
the
est en train de vivre
negotiations on
la
the
négociation
Convention
sur
on
le
plastic
projet de
wastes
convention
and
sur les déchets
also
plastiques
on
et la
pandemic
négociation sur la
convention,
convention sur les
which we
pandémies
introduced
que
yesterday.
nous avons
So the, as
présentée
said,
hier.
rhythm of
Donc le
international
rythme
negotiations
de
on the
négociation
environment is
internationale sur
so
l'environnement ne faiblit
dense,
pas,
you know,
bien
and we
que le
have
contexte global,
everywhere
évidemment, des politiques
environmental
environnementales
policies
menées par les
which
États nous
often
conduisent souvent à
are
nous
key, but
interroger
we wonder
sur
if these
le
objectives,
maintien
universal objectives
des
of the
objectifs
protection of the environment
universels de
are
protection de
maintained,
l'environnement,
and also
mais
if
dans le domaine
diplomacy
diplomatique,
is
ce
still
maintien
existing. This is the main question,
continue à
because
exister.
it's a relentless
Il ne
effort,
ralentit pas.
and
Et
we need,
avant
of course, to work on the
d'aborder la présentation
contents
du
of
contenu
our work. We've been
de
uh,
cet ouvrage que nous avons
doing with
réalisé
Emily
avec
and Ali
Émilie
McGuire,
Gaillard
and I would like to
et Ali Mekoua. Je
warmly
voudrais
thank Ali McGuire
spécialement
Vice President of
remercier à
the
MEKOUAR,
International Center of
vice-président
the
du
Protection
Centre
of the
international
Environmental
des droits
Rights.
comparés de
And
l'environnement,
this
pour sa
is really key, whether on the creation, realization, and implementation of
dans sa
our
réalisation
publication.
et dans sa relecture.
So he's
Parce que,
been
je
doing
dois dire
most of
que
the
c'est
job.
pratiquement lui qui a fait tout le travail.
So
Je vous
thank
remercie,
you,
Monsieur
Ali,
Mékoouar.
once again for
Ali,
your
pour
incredible
cette contribution
work.
importante. Alors, il y a eu dans
So
les années
recently,
récentes
we had several publications.
quelques ouvrages, je ne vais pas
I
tous
won't
les
here
évoquer,
talk
mais
about
ceux
all
qui
of them, but they have been dealing
abordaient
with
un peu
diplomacy,
le thème
environmental
de la
diplomacy.
diplomatie
They have been
environnementale,
published, and I would like
qui
here
sont parus
to
et que je
introduce
voudrais
them to you. So
présenter
first,
d'un mot.
report.
D'abord,
It
un
is more a
rapport
political report at the
plus
National
politique
Assembly,
à l'Assemblée nationale
13th of
du
May.
13 mai 2009,
It is called the Defense
qui
of the
s'intitule
Environment
La
as a
défense de
tool
l'environnement
of environmental
comme un
diplomacy.
outil de la
So this is
diplomatie
a
environnementale.
discovery
Et donc,
from
c'est
the
un peu la
French
découverte
Parliament. And we
du
have a
gouvernement
specific
français qu'il
diplomacy
y a une
based on the
diplomatie
environment
spécifique
connected to
environnementale
the
liée
defense of the
à la
environment.
défense de
So
l'environnement.
then in
Et puis,
2013,
en
another
2013,
publication called Negotiations,
un
International
ouvrage qui
Negotiations,
s'appelle
which
Négociations
have been
internationales,
published under the direction
qui a
of
été publié sous
Franck
la
Petitoville
direction
and
de
Delphine
Franck Petitoville
Lédi-Fro,
et de Delphine
published at the
Lédi-Frotte,
edition
publié aux
Sciences Po Les
éditions
Presse, where
Sciences
a
Po Les
great
Presses,
part of the
dans
international
lequel une grande
negotiations
partie de l'ouvrage sur
are
les négociations
based
internationales
on
porte,
specific
comme par hasard,
examples
sur des
connected to
exemples
the
relatifs à
environment.
l'environnement.
Because as you know, we
Parce
have more and
qu'évidemment,
more
il y a de plus en
negotiations
plus
connected
de
to
négociations
environmental issues. And
environnementales.
third
Et puis, le
publication,
troisième ouvrage que je voudrais
which
évoquer
has been published after a
a
conference
été publié à la suite d'un colloque
who was held in
qui a eu lieu
2014.
en
This publication
2014,
published in
un
2015
ouvrage
under the
publié en
direction of
2015
Eric
sous la direction
Canal-Forgue
de Eric
called
Canal-Forgue,
Democracy and
s'intitule
Diplomacy and
Démocratie
Environmental
et
Diplomacy.
diplomatie
So in that
environnementale.
specific
Et dans cet
publication,
ouvrage très intéressant, Démocratie et
they
diplomatie
introduce
environnementale,
in a very
il présente
classical
d'une
way
façon assez
how
classique et
the
approfondie
three
finalement les trois
highlights
temps
are,
de la diplomatie
explained.
environnementale.
First,
Le
the
temps de la
negotiation
négociation,
process.
le
Second,
processus de négociation,
the
le temps ensuite
decision-making process and
de la
its
décision
application.
et de l'application,
Third,
le processus de la décision et de l'application,
the
et enfin, troisième temps,
control,
le
monitoring,
temps du
implementation
processus de
process,
contrôle,
right?
de la mise en œuvre
So as you
de ces
see, we
conventions
have these
internationales.
three
Donc,
highlights, which
effectivement,
are
ce sont les
quite
trois temps
classical,
précis
connected to the
de la
environmental diplomacy.
diplomatie
So our
environnementale.
publication is, let's
Alors,
say,
notre ouvrage
situated in this
se situe
first
plutôt dans le
highlight,
premier temps,
which is the
à savoir
negotiation
le temps du
process.
processus
But
de la
it has a
négociation.
slight difference
Mais à la
because
différence de
contrary to the
l'ouvrage ou
documents I've
document
just
que je viens
introduced,
de
our
présenter,
book, our work has
notre
a
livre
different ambition, which
a une
is
autre ambition.
not to
Il ne
describe
s'agit pas
the
de décrire
proper
uniquement la
negotiation or
négociation
international
des traités internationaux
treaties or
selon la Convention de Vienne sur les traités
also
et
the
selon l'apport plus ou moins intense
Dalmatic
de la
Declaration, which
fameuse
has been
déclaration
adopted
dalmatique
during the second
adoptée
conference
à la
of the
deuxième
Aarhus
conférence des
Conference
parties
in
de la Convention
2005,
d'Aarhus
and
en
it is
2005
an
et
incentive
qui incite
for the
fortement
actors to
les acteurs de la
negotiate and to
négociation
apply
environnementale
the big principles of the
d'appliquer
Aarhus
les grands
Conference, which is
principes de la
information,
Convention d'Aarhus,
participation, and
l'information, la participation
in
et
the
puis la
framework of the
justice,
process,
mais
which is
dans le cadre
international
du
negotiation.
processus
So it is a
international de
document
négociation, et donc
not
un
only for
document
the
qui
states,
s'adresse
but I would
non
say
pas tant aux États,
specifically for the
mais qui
international
s'adresse aux
institutions
institutions
and the
internationales,
secretariats of
les
big
secrétariats des
conventions,
conventions,
and
les
namely
secrétariats des grandes conventions,
the
et qui
so-called
s'adresse ce qu'on appelle les parties prenantes, les acteurs
NGOs and
démocratiques,
other
notamment les ONG,
institution
qui sont
organisms
prévus de plus en
which
plus
are
comme
acting
acteurs,
behind the scenes
souvent dans les
as main
coulisses,
actors.
comme acteurs de la
So
négociation
our
internationale.
publication will
Et
not
donc notre ouvrage
introduce
ne va pas
these,
présenter les fondements théoriques
fundamentals and
sur la
of course
base à la
connected
fois
to
de la
the
Convention de
different
Rome
conventions,
et de la
but
Déclaration
it
d'Atlantique,
will give
mais va
more
présenter des contributions
contributions,
inédites
which are the
sur ce qu'on
so-called
appelait
behind
les
the
coulisses
scenes,
de
behind the
la
scenes
négociation
negotiations,
environnementale et de la
in
diplomatie
order
environnementale au
to,
sens général,
shed light
pour
together with
essayer,
the
avec
main
les
actors
acteurs
which
de
did
ceux
participate to
qui
those
ont
negotiations,
effectivement
to
participé à ces
understand
négociations,
how they
de
actually
voir comment se
are
déroulent ces
organized
négociations
beyond
au-delà
the
de
official
l'aspect
uh,
officiel
organization, I
et
would say.
juridiquement
So
organisé.
we have been
Et c'est
selecting
ainsi que nous
in a
avons
very,
sélectionné, sûrement de façon tout à fait
let's say, personal
hasardeuse
way,
et non scientifique,
several
sélectionné des
volunteers
volontaires, pas
to,
encore trouvé les volontaires,
give voice to
pour
those
donner ces témoignages.
to those
Les uns ont
witnessing
été
aspects.
donnés
So,
par des
for
contributions
example, it
écrites,
was through the
les autres ont été donnés à travers des contributions enregistrées,
questionnaires and
à
also,
travers un questionnaire qu'il a fallu
texts which
ensuite
has been
traiter
written.
et
We have
rédiger.
23
Et le résultat,
contributions
c'est 23
globally, which
contributions
come from around 20
provenant
different countries
d'une vingtaine de
and
pays différents,
with several
avec
personalities
des
which are
personnalités
very, very, high
qui ont
profile
des profils
personalities, very,
socio-professionnels
very different,
très variés,
because we have
puisqu'il
diplomats, we
s'agit à la fois
have also
évidemment de diplomates,
politicians
mais
and
aussi de
lawyers
politiciens,
and
de juristes,
jurists,
d'avocats,
professors, but also international
universitaires, de
members of
fonctionnaires
organizations
internationaux
and also militants
et de
from
militants
NGOs. So
d'organisations
you see a
non
great panel
gouvernementales.
of
Et
actors
donc un panel
which took part
d'acteurs
to,
de la
those big
négociation.
conventions. We tried
On
to
a
interview
essayé
them behind the scenes
d'interviewer
just to
dans les
understand
coulisses
how
pour voir comment
these
se sont
big
passées
international
les
conventions
grandes
are
négociations
organized and how they,
internationales
uh,
depuis une
how they are really
quarantaine, une
working.
cinquantaine
So
d'années.
um,
Et donc, le
this is
résultat,
why
c'est
on the
cet
screen, I
ouvrage que
think
vous
you can
voyez
see the
sur l'écran, je
first
pense,
page and the
la page
list
de
of
garde et la liste
the
des différentes
personalities which
personnalités
intervened.
qui ont contribué
So
et qui,
we
leurs
have here
participants,
a great
nous
opportunity
montrent
to
un
understand
peu
how these
comment
negotiations
se
are
déroulent
prepared.
ces
So I will
négociations.
not here
Alors, je ne vais pas
talk
vous
too
révéler
much about
le
that
contenu de cet
Déjà,
ouvrage.
because,
première page
you
de
need to
couverture,
read it
c'est
and to
premier
Déjà,
discover
c'est
it
la
by
révélation
yourselves,
de la
but
première page de
this
couverture.
publication
Mais très rapidement,
will
un
be
ouvrage va
available
sortir,
soon,
fera l'objet d'une
and
présentation
together with the
qui sera
Chaire Normandie pour la
préparée
Paix, and
avec l'appui de la
also
chaire
it
Normandie
will
pour la
be
paix, et ensuite qui sera
diffused
évidemment
everywhere. So I will
largement
not talk too much
diffusé.
here,
Mais donc, je ne vais pas
and
vous révéler le contenu, je vais
just to
simplement,
tell you that
à
I
cette
we
étape,
have several,
insister sur
global
des
elements
éléments plus généraux
coming
du
from the
contexte
international negotiations,
de la
which
négociation
are key because you
internationale,
understand how
telle
they
qu'elle se
are,
déroule
put
à l'heure
together and how
actuelle,
we lived
telle que j'ai
them as
moi-même l'ai
the
vécue
president of an
comme
international
président d'une ONG
NGO. And,
internationale,
behind the
aussi dans les
scenes,
coulisses,
this
parce que
concept
les
of behind the
ONG sont dans
scenes
les
is key
coulisses,
because
et bien
NGOs are
sûr,
always
où elles
behind
ne
the scenes.
participent pas
So, they
officiellement
actively
et
participate in
directement
that
aux
framework.
négociations.
But now,
Et
just
alors, je
coming back
voudrais
to
simplement
three other
évoquer
elements, which are key as
trois
well.
éléments
First,
principaux
of course, connected to these
relatifs
negotiations
à ces
still.
négociations
The first
environnementales.
element is to
Le premier, c'est
understand
de
the
relever
multiplicity of the
la
places
multiplicité
of
des
negotiation,
lieux de
because
négociation.
obviously,
Parce
juridically,
qu'évidemment,
it is the
juridiquement, le
plenary
lieu de
assembly
négociation,
which
c'est
is
l'Assemblée
adopting a
plénière qui
document,
adopte
adopting a
le
treaty,
document,
adopting
qui
a
adopte le
resolution.
traité, qui
This
adopte
is,
la
let's say,
résolution.
the most
Ça, c'est la
legal
face
juridical
juridique
aspect. But
de
then,
la
if you
négociation.
go
Mais il faut bien
further, we
voir
have
que
several
les
other
lieux de
places which are very
négociation
much
peuvent être
diversified.
plus
For example, we
diversifiés et
have
multiples. Il y a des
so-called
phases
institutional
qu'on pourrait
juridical
qualifier de
places,
juridico-institutionnelles,
which
de
are probably
para-institutionnelles,
even more important than the official negotiation steps. We have committees, which, the so-called preparatory committees, but not only during this period of time of final negotiation, but specifically beforehand. So before this process, before the official negotiations, we had so many committees which acted together with experts, and they contributed to that effort, which means working, trying to give first like drafts and then working groups, and this is of course connected to parallel events, because they, as said, they took place and they take place before official events. So it's symposiums and, as you said, or other conferences where NGOs or states just, explain what they want, explain their ideas, explain their projects, and Émilie Gaillard, by the way, participated to many of them. You went to Dubai, you went to Japan, in parallel events, parallel conventions. In these events, in these occasions, you just impulse, let's say, other ideas, and could be friends from the president, friends from this, specific political party, which could be, in favor of some ideas. So this is exactly the pre-negotiations, as said, or behind the scenes negotiations. And this is probably the most fundamental aspect, because it will determine the content. And then we have a second aspect, and I would like to, dwell on that. It's a huge aspect as well. It's the legal aspect and the legal importance of rights, and how jurisdiction is fundamental, having, of course, highlights, having sometimes non-existent according to the steps. So obviously it's almost in the final part of the negotiations of the final text that law is key, is crucial, just because states know that vocabulary used for each article will be not only political, but becomes a juridical, legal vocabulary, because it will be the last text, the final text adopted. So you see, the articles actually change their sense. Could be diplomatical, scientific, or political, but little by little, they become more juridical. So this means that you have so many interpreters, which means lawyers and experts in law, which will intervene afterwards, like putting out the sense and trying to give a more scientific aspect to that term, to that specific word, and so on. So I would like to come back to a recent experience we had with Émilie in Paris during the negotiations of the plastic waste project convention. We saw how the law jurisdiction had such an important role, and specifically during the second round of the debates, of the negotiations on the plastic waste. And we were talking for 3 days and a half of the national regulations connected to that. So normally it wouldn't be the case. At the beginning, the president would explain how the regulation is, and sometimes it is sometimes temporary regulation, just because not all the states are there, and the negotiations can start. So it's a consensus which is adopted by all the states present, and this is exactly how it starts. Some states just, talked about internal regulations, and for 3 days and a half, they just, had disputes and did not agree on that. And we were not talking about plastics. We only talked about regulations, you see, through internal regulations. So I think it's one of the, probably the first time that we had such an intensity that law had such an important role to play. And they just, undermined then the conference, because we couldn't talk about plastics. We should have been talked about plastic for plastics for 5 days, but we only talked about one day. So 4 days were spent about regulations and internal laws. So you see, you need to anticipate this kind of incident, trying to solve beforehand these contents and these issues. So this is why the strategy is connected to the role of the president as well, to try to avoid this kind of situation. Third point during negotiations is connected to, the participation of NGOs to the negotiations. So, of course, negotiations on the field, but also scientific NGOs, international NGOs on working on jurisdiction. So this is part of our job, of our work here, and what we did about this research and the NGOs' role, which is absolutely key. Sometimes their role is too limited, but anyways, they are present. So could be officially and not officially behind the scenes, but they are facing very, very key obstacles.
Qui sont des obstacles à l'effectivité du rôle.
So obstacles in terms of the NGOs in the presentation. So if we look at the declaration of 2005, the conference of Afrarus, the problem of transparency of the information, to what extent NGOs have the information beyond the official channels, because before the zero draft, so the text you can start to discuss, there is and we don't have access to the first drafts. So we are quite powerless as jurists to point the legal problems that we need to point at. We can only intervene when we look at the text and we know what is happening in the negotiations. And here, when we don't have the zero draft, therefore the proposals of the CIDCE are blind proposals, because they're only purely theoretical proposals, because they don't rely on the text that the negotiators will present. Therefore, transparency is done upstream of the negotiations. It is an important obstacle. And then during the negotiation, there is a series of sessions, and we don't have access to them. There is a limited access. These sessions are only open to state representatives. Therefore, in June, there were sessions which were open sessions, and there were closed sessions. And there was an open session when we discussed a paragraph on non-regression. And it was hard to formulate this proposal on non-regression. Well, at the time, there was a debate, an intense discussion, a legal discussion between the EU and developing countries on whether the non-regression principle was a legal principle or not. But this was a limited committee. It was open to NGOs, but NGOs did not have a voice. So I was invited, but I could not talk. And then there were other representatives who defended a non-regression principle in the face of other organizations. So these are the obstacles that we can meet during the negotiations. So I wanted to summarize the contributions of our work and the previous works that I've mentioned, and check out the recommendations that we could phrase, that we could formulate on how to support international negotiations, whether you're a diplomat or a non-state actor, an NGO, because these are recommendations for everyone. And these recommendations would be the following. Of course, respecting the formal rules, written rules, but as well as customary rules. Customs plays an important role. So written rules in the negotiations, we need to comply with them. They vary depending on the forum, depending on some regions, some traditions. And then we have different customs that are particular to the United Nations or the Council of Europe, or each international organization has their own rules, their own customs, and we need to adapt to a multiplicity of rules, whether they are formal or informal. Then after that, we need to use informal contacts. We all have informal contacts through our relationships with others. So it's not all to have just a network of people around you, a lot of business cards, but we need to use these informal contacts through the negotiations and through the different discussions during the coffee breaks, during the lunch breaks, etc. We need to use these informal relationships. This is an art in a negotiation. We need to be able to mobilize bilateral relationships because, of course, we are always closer to our territorial friends for linguistic reasons, for scientific reasons. So we need to use these bilateral relationships in an informal manner. We need to be able to activate alliances, regional, cultural, linguistic alliances, legal alliances, a series of alliances. And generally, we forget about them. So we also need to trigger some coalitions. We need to gather people who come from different horizons, and we need to put them in touch one with the other. You know, a Northern American person with a South American person, we can put them in touch because they have the same ideas, but they don't know each other. So non-state actors and facilitating networks, facilitating coalitions. And then there is a general principle which I don't really like, but I will mention it nonetheless, because then there is reality, you know, diplomatic realism, you know, and there was the following principles which I don't really like because they're not very idealistic, but I prefer the idealistic principles to the realistic principles. But these are the realistic principles. To start a negotiation, you need to reduce your ambitions. To start a negotiation, you need to reduce your ambitions. So of course, for us, it's very hard to reduce our ambitions because we are idealistic people. But sometimes we have to go back to the basics. So this is really at the beginning of the negotiations. And then, of course, there is the level of the conclusion of the negotiations. And diplomatic realism teaches us that to conclude a negotiation, you need to accept some compromises. Thank you very much. That's great that we have this kind of explanation. Thank you very much, Michel. I think that with your book, I have a feeling that we're opening up a collection because this is a topic that could be really dealt with in various different ways. They're not just conferences, the role of side events. You know, in Japan, we had promoted human rights. There was nothing in the first draft about human rights. The last convention at the UNESCO where we were taken hostage by a very restricted group and in a very specific context, a war context, and we lost 2 days, well, actually 3 days, 3.5 days. It was incredible. And there were delegates from Latin America stating that all delegates from all over the world traveled there, paid by the taxpayers' money, and were all taken hostage by 4 people who really you know, played on very technical questions. You know, you have Michel Prieur in the room, you know, and he has an expertise to give. And what is really difficult to see is that there is no room left for experts. Sometimes there is no no voice given to experts, but not given, not during the negotiation. So I think we need to improve this because maybe there should be an expert for all delegations in one given field. This is the impression I have from the outside. I would like to also warmly thank Catherine Lebris, who is a specialist who was there with us in Japan. There are many others. It's great to share this experience with jurists specialized in international questions. I think this book is just a first step. I don't see it as a conclusion. There are more than 20 chapters, lots of different contributors. I would like to thank Christina Voigt, who is the president of the World Commission for Environmental Law at the IUCN, who supported us all along and whom you will hear tomorrow, because there is a great project that is brought forward with the session and on climate justice. And Christina Voigt is a jurist specialized in international law and who supported this work in which diplomats contributed. There are professionals who made a career at the UN who contributed. So we hope that this book will interest students, that it will feed other dynamics, that I hope it will open up a series. For example, yesterday we had a session on the rights of indigenous peoples, and I would love to also have a book on the rights of indigenous peoples with NGOs, with diplomats. In a Normandy Chair for Peace, what is great is that everything is connected, and one of the key figures who participated in the drafting of the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, Justice Davide, who is Filipino, was also the judge in the Supreme Court in the Philippines, who recognized the rights of future generations in the Oposa versus Vectoran law case. So everything is connected beyond the disciplines, the legal disciplines. Everything is connected. And tomorrow we will talk about civil society, and we will talk about diplomacy led by civil society on an international scale. So you see, there are different structures led by the states, led by the experts. So this was a great thesis. Maybe you should mention the thesis of your student about environmental diplomacy. Yes. This was a great thesis on non-state actors. This was the third phase, the control of the enforcement of the law. So Jean-Michel Attal
C'est Jean-Michel Attah qui a fait
wrote his
sa
thesis in
thèse
Limoges
Limoges
in
en
2020,
2020, je
I
crois,
think, and he
et qui a
studied
systématiquement
the
étudié les
legal
processus
and
juridiques
paralegal
et parajuridiques
processes of the
de la
participation of
participation
NGOs
des ONG
with regards to
spécialement,
the
mais dans le
enforcement of
contrôle de
laws,
l'application et de la mise en
so
œuvre,
beyond
au-delà des
the
institutions officielles de
the
contrôle.
standard
Et donc, c'est la
enforcement
troisième phase de la négociation
bodies,
diplomatique. Il faudrait maintenant qu'il y ait une thèse
and
sur
it
l'amont
is
qui rende
interesting
compte
to
justement de la
to
première et
look
de la
at
deuxième
this.
phase
It would
pour
be good to
compléter, ça ferait les deux
complement
autres
to
phases,
this
les deux
thesis.
autres volumes
Yes, the
L'appel est
call
lancé,
has been
alors.
made.
On
We
va
will
vous
have a short
proposer une
break.
petite
Is
pause.
there a
Est-ce qu'il y a des
question and
questions-réponses? Attendez, je
is
regarde
there a
avant
question
de
here
rendre
before
l'antenne.
we take a
Question-réponse.
break? I think this was for before.
Non,
Okay,
ça c'était pour tout
so
à l'heure, je pense.
anyway,
Ok.
we
En
will
tout cas,
have a 15
on
minutes of
on
break. We will
s'accorde un quart d'heure
meet
de
again
pause et on
at
se retrouve à 11h10.
11:10.
À 11h10,
And
nous
we
allons
will open up a new
entamer une nouvelle session
session
qui
which
nous
is
tient
close to
particulièrement à
my
cœur et
heart
à
with
toutes les personnes qui ont participé à ce
everybody who
colloque,
participated
qui est le
in the
colloque sur la boussole
conference
des
on
possibles
the
de Mireille
compass of
Delmas-Marty, cérémonie de
possibilities,
recherche numéro 12. Vous voyez bien
the work of
qu'aujourd'hui,
Mireille
par rapport à
Delmas-Marty.
hier, où
So
vraiment on a
we
parlé de
talked about
sujets
the
vraiment
specific
d'expertise
expertise
précis,
yesterday,
aujourd'hui on va
and
prendre
today we
une
will
approche
have a
plus
more
holistique
holistic
sur cette
approach,
innovation
and we will
responsable, sur
talk
ces
about the compass
négociations
of
et la
possibilities
boussole des possibles.
of
À tout
Mrs.
à l'heure.
Delmas-Marty.